Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about technical projects. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do you pick your technical projects to advance your career? Well, it depends on where you are, I would say, in your career, sort of what's going to improve your career. Uh, so for example, for a junior level software developer, the technical projects that exposes you to the sort of work that you commonly do is the way to go, because the impact you have on the work that you do in the early days is fairly low if you compare it to the sort of influence you're going to have be able to have if you're at the higher levels. Let me explain that a little bit, because when you start, even if you have ideas and suggestions and so forth, the vast majority of the reason as to why you get hired is to help out with the coding itself. That changes a little bit the higher up you get, like the more experience you get. So in the early days, the best thing for you is sort of, as I like to say, go to a boot. I'm not saying a literal boot camp now. I'm saying, you need to go through the basics. Boot camp as in the military or the army or whatever they do, like the basics of producing value for a software team and a software company. So those sorts of projects are usually the way. It was the way that I picked as well in the early days. I basically built all the common quote unquote stuff until I knew it so well that it wasn't really fun anymore. And then when you get a little bit more advanced, usually when you get to your mid levels, like after a year or 2 or 3 or something like that, depends from person to person, but when you're in the mid-range of your career, you're going to start most likely benefiting more from becoming a philosopher. Or, well, I usually don't like working with philosophers that are too opinionated, but you're going to enter into that sphere of IT. Your thoughts are, it's almost like growing up as becoming a teenager and becoming very idealistic. And in those sorts of scenarios, the best thing I've found when it comes to picking technical projects is to try to focus on projects that will teach you tools that are relevant to your work, but you try to figure out what are better ways for you of doing work, what are more efficient ways and more stable ways of doing work. This is where you sort of start almost. To me, this is where like the makings of a senior software developer starts, because usually people stick here, like they like they never really get out of this area where they focus mostly on, okay, how can I do work in a better way? Because you know all your tools, you know all the stuff, right? But there are other tools that you may have not tried out, and there are other patterns of working that might be new to you. So picking projects where you get to play around with new technology, or picking stuff that forces you to write code in a different way, or like this is usually where you get into functional programming, for example, if that's your taste, or other similar sorts of stuff, right? And most people stay here. When you get to be a well, you can be. This is the thing. Like, well, this is where I make a difference. This is where a mid-level all the way up to what we call a senior by today's standards. These are the sorts of projects that are usually very useful to the to people who are in that sphere. If you get to a point where you are a what I call a true senior, then this is still what is applicable, but there is one more angle to it, and that is that the projects that will benefit you the most are bordering on thought leadership, if that makes sense. Where the projects where you usually will grow the most is when you're literally finding not just ways for yourself to work in a better way. You are looking into fixing fundamental problems with the software development process. An example would be this is where you figure out how to structure, say, a monorepo, or what set up a microservices architecture in a multi-team setup is how that's going to work, or you figure out ways of storing data in a format that is going to be more efficient than if you do it some other way. But at the same time, this is where the gurus are, guys. These are where the guys and girls that make most of the tools that you see on Tech Talks and so forth. This is the sphere of technical products that they usually start out with. And the difficult part here is usually to find that balance between a really cool, sophisticated, usually fairly sophisticated ideas, and what is applicable and pragmatic for other people. This is as an example where if you're in front end, like your projects like Storybook or React or Angular or Vue, etc., this is the sort of stuff the top-notch developers of the world work on. Usually, or this is where they really they get to challenge themselves. If that makes sense, they will grow from this. Whereas at the lower level, it's usually about learning those tools, learning how to consume them and use them as a software developer. That's really, as I like to say, this is where most people are, and so forth. But when you're getting to that level, you're basically finding projects, like your personal projects are trend setting in thought leadership usually, in comparison. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way I pick my personal projects, or if I pick technical projects, depends on, is what I argue, it depends on where you are in your career. In the early days, usually what I did was that I picked just, I tried to learn how to use a loop, or like I was trying to learn how to set up a server, use a certain framework or something like that. And I did that for many years until I got sort of, I know how to set up a server in my sleep now. And then you start looking into doing different types of testing, test-driven development. How do you do that, and what's the difference between that and integration testing? And then I started playing around with microservices. I started playing around with all kinds of different approaches to doing work. And then after a while, I started making projects where it's sort of, it's not even anchored anymore in something that is perhaps that useful for, like, it's not directly useful, if that makes sense, for the work that I do as a software developer, but it's at the point where it's more for me to expand my mind and the way I think about not just software development, but the way I think about all the work that software developers do, and how to structure in not only like code but work processes. How do you put together teams, etc., where I work on personal projects where it's almost more theoretical and academic than it might be, and this is usually the stuff that I've found to help me guide along my thought process. And that is the key learning I want you to take away, and that is that it all depends on you. What will expand your mind at this given moment? And in the early days, as I said, it's just getting the concepts right. And in the later days, it's like you have problems that you haven't found any off-the-shelf tool or framework, or nobody else seems to know how to fix this problem. So you start like experimenting. It's almost like a little mad professor putting together different chemicals, and then it's blowing up in your face, and then you go and put some other chemicals together just to see what happens. You're almost experimenting with your project, seeing what happens. That's what I've found to be my pattern, at the very least, when I pick my technical projects. Have a great day.